Hi, my name is Liz Lightfoot, and I'm a professor at the School of Social Work at Arizona State University. And I'd like to welcome you to the training, Supporting Parents with Disabilities, an overview for social service providers. The development of this training was supported by a small grant from the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, which receives a contract from the Administration for Community Living, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. The purpose of developing this training was to provide basic training and an overview to social workers and other social service providers who work and support parents with disabilities. What I'll go over on this training is a little bit of the historical context, some important policies related to working with parents with disabilities, as well as some of our current state of our research. I'll also introduce you to 8 core concepts that can sort of ground your practice to working with parents with disabilities, and introduce you to some promising social work practice models and provide you some best practice tips. And I will also point you to some resources where you can get more information on supporting parents with disabilities as a social service provider. I also give you a link to a user-friendly guidebook that I developed along with my team that provides social service providers some basic information on how to provide best practices to parents with disabilities. We'll start off with some historical context. And this grainy photo is a photo of Carrie Buck on the left and her mother. And Carrie Buck was party to an infamous Supreme Court case related to parents with disabilities. And to give you a little background to this, in the 20th century, we had a movement called the eugenics movement. And it's really important to understand the eugenics movement as it sort of provides a context to what our current policies are like and what some current attitudes are like to parents with disabilities. So the eugenics movement was popular in the United States and actually in a lot of the world in the late 1800s through the middle 20th century. And the eugenics movement was really about focusing on who was allowed to have children. And there was concerns and lots of discussion about how disabilities and what was considered undesirable traits were inherited. And so to get rid of these undesirable traits, there were activities that were particularly related to restricting childbearing for people with disabilities, and also people of color and immigrants and people who've been convicted of crimes were some of the main targets of the eugenics movement. And this movement was actually pretty popular in the 1920s and 30s in the United States in the 40s. And there were laws passed that actually provided that gave state-sanctioned sterilization of people with disabilities without their consent. So the first state law was passed in the 1910s in Indiana that said it was okay for the state of Indiana to determine that they would sterilize a person with a disability without their consent. And after the Indiana passed its law, a number of other states passed similar laws following Indiana. So within just 7 years, over a dozen other states had passed similar state-sanctioned sterilization laws. And this led to the state of Virginia passing a similar law in 1924. And this is where Carrie Buck lived. And it said, I'm going to read this to you, that it called for the sterilization of people with disabilities who were, quote, afflicted with hereditary forms of insanity that are current idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, or epilepsy. So it's using, sort of horrible language here. So Buck versus Bill, so this Virginia law led to this famous Buck versus Bill U.S. Supreme Court case involving Carrie Buck on the left. So she was a young woman who was placed in an institution for what they called back then feeble-minded, though many now question whether she actually had a disability at all. And this picture was taken in 1924. So this became the intention to sterilize Carrie Buck made it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld this Virginia law allowing forced sterilization without consent for people who it considered unfit to reproduce. So this ruling sort of legitimized the eugenic practices in the United States and led to the sterilization of tens of thousands of people. And one of the quotes in the decision made by Oliver Wendell Holmes, a famous Supreme Court justice, where he infamously declared, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So in the 5 years following the Buck versus Bill decision, 17 more states passed laws. So there was a total of 33 states that had these state-sanctioned sterilization laws targeting people with disabilities in the early 20th century. And tens of thousands of people were involuntarily sterilized. And there's estimates that there were 20,000 people with disabilities sterilized without their consent in California or alone. So the main targets, of course, were people with disabilities and people living in state institutions, including state disability institutions. This is also when we had those big, huge institutions where people were kept in inhumane conditions, as well as prisons. People of color and poor people had a higher likelihood to be sterilized than others. So these forced sterilization laws were really, really horrible. In fact, they were so horrible that these were laws that were studied by Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler modeled some of the Nazi eugenics policies after the policies in the United States. This actually sort of led to the downfall of the eugenics movement after the horrors of World War II were realized, and these practices and policies really fell out of favor in the United States, but I wouldn't say all the way out of favor. So they kind of transformed. And I'll say that people with disabilities are still sterilized at a younger age on average and more frequently than people without disabilities. But it tends to be what's called voluntaries. But I would say that some of this might be coerced. So people are talked into agreeing to be sterilized at an early age. So where this sort of shifted into this voluntary sterilization, there still were concerns about people with disabilities being parents. And so it sort of shifted away from sterilization to the really active involvement of child protection units and removing children and even babies from parents with disabilities after they were born. And that's kind of where we are right now. But I think understanding this eugenics movement is helpful for understanding the current situation. If we jump forward to the modern time, we actually have a growing body of research where we know more about people with disabilities and their parenting. So first of all, we know that people with disabilities have kids. People with disabilities have always had kids. People with all types of disabilities have kids. We know that people with disabilities are less likely to have kids than people without disabilities, but they do have kids. We also know a lot now about their involvement in the child protection system, and this is really important for social workers and other social service providers. So first, we know that people with disabilities are much more likely to be reported for child abuse and neglect. So more likely to have people call up the child protection system and report their worries about child abuse and neglect. And there's a number of reasons why they might be more likely to be reported for child abuse and neglect. One is that something called the exposure hypothesis. So the exposure hypothesis means that people with disabilities, parents with disabilities, are more likely to be exposed to mandated reporters. So mandated reporters are people who are required by law to report suspected child abuse and neglect. So the exposure hypothesis has been studied to look at the overrepresentation of people of color, particularly Black people and Indigenous folks in the child welfare system, and it's sort of inconclusive about that. But for people with disabilities, parents with disabilities, it makes a lot of sense because parents with disabilities, with significant disabilities, might have might be interacting with people in their home every day who are coming in to provide support. And a lot of these folks are mandated reporters. So that's one reason why parents with disabilities are much more likely to be reported for child abuse and neglect. We know that when parents with disabilities are reported to child protection agencies, they're much more likely to have abuse substantiated than parents without disabilities. They're more likely to have their children placed in foster care or out-of-home placement than parents without disabilities who have substantiated treatment. And we also know that they're much more likely to have their parental rights terminated than parents without disabilities. We also know that social service providers get very little training on supporting parents with disabilities. And actually, it's not just about parents with disabilities, it's about disabilities in general. And this is something that the social work field has been grappling with for decades, is that we don't provide enough training to our social workers and social service providers who work with people with disabilities, even though it's one of the largest populations that social service providers and social workers work with. But we still don't have, we don't regularly have classes on working with people with disabilities in, for example, in social work curriculum. Only a few universities have these classes. We also know that disability is often included in diversity classes, but it might be 1 week. So future social workers might have 1 week of training or one session in a class on working with people with disabilities, even though it might be a large population they're working with. We also know that there's very few services and supports for parents with disabilities. There's lots of services and supports for individuals with disabilities, but there's not very many services that are targeted to help people with disabilities in their parenting. So when I'm doing these trainings, I often get the question, well, are parents with disabilities more likely to be in their reported to the child welfare system because they maltreat their children at higher rates? That is a good question, but it is not true. We don't have any evidence showing that people with disabilities, parents with disabilities, are more likely to abuse or neglect their children. This hasn't been studied a whole lot, and there have been some studies that have shown that people with very low IQs might be more likely to neglect their kids. But in general, we have very little evidence to show that people with disabilities, with all types of disabilities, aside from that one caveat, are more likely to abuse or neglect their kids. And there's actually some research that shows that parents with disabilities are less likely to do some types of abuse or neglect. For example, parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities there's very little likelihood that they will sexually abuse their kids. What about risk factors? So parents with disabilities often do have risk factors that are associated with higher abuse or neglect of children, but parental disability itself is not a risk factor. It's just these associated risk factors. For example, unstable housing is a risk factor for child abuse and neglect. Parents with disabilities are more likely to have unstable housing because people with disabilities have much lower employment rates or higher unemployment rates, if you want to look at it that way, than individuals without disabilities. So they might be more likely to have unstable housing situations. But it's not the parental disability that's the risk factor, it's the unstable housing that's the risk factor. So what about child outcomes? So that's another question. How do kids of parents with disabilities fare? Well, there's been a little bit of research into this, and there have been some really large population studies where they're looking, doing a national sample. There was a study in Australia that did a national sample of children who had parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they first found that some of the kids were more likely to have developmental delays than kids who didn't have a parent with an intellectual disability. But then when they controlled for things like poverty and unstable housing, they found that these differences faded away. So kids who have parents with disabilities actually fare pretty similarly to kids whose parents don't have disabilities. And there's actually been some studies that have shown that kids who have parents with some types of disabilities actually have some better outcomes. So there was a really interesting study of kids who had parents who had MS, and it found that the kids whose parents had MS actually had some better outcomes, particularly related to peer relationships. Now we'll shift to talk about some policies related to parents with disabilities. I took myself off the screen so you could see the slides a little bit better for now. So there are both state level policies and federal level policies that affects social service practice with parents with disabilities and also affect the lives of parents with disabilities. I'm not going to talk about all the details, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So first, there's state level policies, and I'm going to focus on the state level child welfare and family policies. State child welfare policies, those are all state level policies. Every state has their own statute, and they actually vary quite a bit. But this is what actually got me really interested in this topic. I was involved in a different research project, and I started looking up some state child welfare policies to see how disability was defined. And I was pretty shocked to see how parental disability was included as grounds for termination of parental rights. So parental disability was listed as one of the grounds for terminating parental rights. And then I sort of went down the rabbit hole and looked up every state law, looked up the definitions, and spent weeks going through all of these and developed sort of an analysis of how state child welfare statutes were including parental disabilities in their state laws. And I'll give you an example of this from Arizona. So every state has a child welfare statute, and it lists termination of parental rights and gives grounds. So this is an example of how it might work. I won't read the whole thing, but this is what the law would look like. So this is about termination of parental rights, and it says, if there's evidence to justify the termination of parental-child relationship shall include any one of the following. And then it has this long list, a long list of reasons why parental rights can be terminated. And number 3 in this list in Arizona is that the parent is unable to discharge parental responsibilities because of mental illness, mental deficiency, and then goes on to talk about substance use. So the law actually says that parental disability is grounds for termination of parental rights. So when I was looking through all of these, I added them all up and found out that 37 states, or 3/4 of the states, had parental disability listed as grounds for termination of parental rights. And so what's problematic with including parental disability in these states' laws? Many of the states who have these laws, including this example up here, use outdated and what's now considered offensive language from referring to a parent's disability, particularly related to intellectual or developmental disabilities. And you can see in this law, they talk about mental deficiency. So that's terminology that goes way back to the 1940s and 50s and doesn't align with modern legal, medical, or social definitions. Most of the states actually use this kind of mental deficiency language. The second is that disability just isn't defined. And so in many of these state statutes, they're using this old language and they don't actually have a corresponding definition of what they mean by something like mental deficiency. Finally is the focus on conditions rather than behaviors. And it's the only grounds for termination of parental rights in these state statutes that focuses on something that's a condition of the individual rather than something they're doing. So for example, there's never a state statute that says that poverty, that someone being in the conditions of poverty or poor is grounds for termination of parental rights. It's rather the behavior the parent is doing, such as neglect. But when you have parental disability language in state child protection statutes, it can result in professionals focusing on disability rather than behavior. And that's what we've seen happen, is actually that what happens is there's a lot of focus on determining that the parent has a disability without assessing whether the parent can actually parent their child or not. We'll turn to the federal level now. There's a lot of policies at the federal level that also relate to parents with disabilities, particularly the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Prior to about 2015, it was really unclear how the Americans with Disabilities Act, this is the main federal law that prohibits disability discrimination, applies to parents involved in the child protection system, for example. Before 2015, most courts rejected ADA claims brought by parents with disabilities who felt they'd been treated unfairly. So a parent with a disability who was involved in the child protection system and maybe wasn't provided accommodations and felt they were judged unfairly and lost their children, and they file a complaint, and the courts were not allowing ADA to be used as a defense. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and this is the federal law that prohibits disability discrimination based on programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says that organizations such as schools, hospitals, state government agencies, nonprofit agencies that receive federal funding, and including child protection agencies, which receive federal funding. And Section 504 says that you can't discriminate based on disability, but it was really unclear whether these protections extended to parents with disabilities and the rights of their children. This all changed with the release of the Rocking the Cradle report and some subsequent activities that resulted. So in 2012, the National Council on Disability, this is a federal agency that advises the government on disability issues and they released a report called Rocking the Cradle. The National Council on Disabilities, the same agency that released reports calling for what became the Americans with Disabilities Act. This report highlighted this widespread discrimination against parents with disabilities, and they also replicated that study that I had done in 2006 showing serious concerns in child protection laws. But one of the areas it really called for was stronger application of the ADA and the Rehab Act in child protection cases. Now, this report received a whole lot of media attention. National Council on Disabilities is an influential agency, and when they release a report, they also do a big media blitz. And so it was covered in national news, local news, international news, newspapers, TV news, got a lot of attention. And this is really needed attention to how parents with disabilities are often unfairly scrutinized by the child protection system. So this happened in 2012. And after this was released, there then was another famous case. And so this case was, we call the Sarah Gordon case. A federal investigation into by the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services involved a case involved a young new mother with a developmental disability named Sarah Gordon. And this investigation led to significant changes in how the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act affected child protection agencies. So what had happened is Sarah Gordon was a young mother who had a baby, and people at the hospital were concerned about her ability to care for her kid. And they were concerned that she felt uncomfortable with the baby, that she couldn't read a clock with hands to schedule the timing of her feedings and things like that. And this led to her baby being removed from her when the baby was just 11 days old. In this investigation, the DOJ and the DHHS found that the Department of Children and Families, that's what Massachusetts Child Protection Agency is called, had failed to consider that she actually had a strong support system in place. So she currently lived with her parents, and her mother had even left her job to help with childcare. So she was living with her parents who were going to help her with childcare. But they didn't take into account that she had the support system in place. They determined that she couldn't independently by herself do all aspects of raising a child, that even if she had these supports around her. So Sarah, and that's a pseudonym, Sarah and her parents fought to get this baby back. And the baby was eventually returned after this investigation, but the baby was 2 years old. So the baby was out of the home for 2 years because there was concerns that the parent, that Sarah was unfit to parent based on some nebulous reasons and this general idea that she was unfit to be a parent and that we shouldn't take into account her support system. And this case became a real powerful example of why we need clear protections for parents with disabilities in the child welfare system. After this study, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice released a joint guidance directly related to this investigation. This guidance is called, I'm reading this now, Protecting the Rights of Parents and Prospective Parents with Disabilities. Technical assistance for state and local child welfare agencies under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So this was the first federal directive making it clear that child protection agencies must protect parents with disabilities from discrimination and ensure decisions are based on facts, not assumptions. So what does this mean? It means that parents with disabilities, if they're involved in the child protection system, they have to be assessed based on their actual abilities and circumstances, right? Like Sarah Gordon wasn't, not assumptions about whether they can parent or not, or stereotypes. And I would argue that some of these assumptions and stereotypes have a long memory back to the eugenics movement. This new guidance also says that parents with disabilities should have full and equal access to child welfare programs and services, and that child welfare agencies have to make reasonable modifications, meaning they have to make necessary changes and provide aids like interpreters or extra time or repeated contact, repeated information, tailored services to support parents with disabilities unless it causes some fundamental change in the program. And it also basically says that you can't discriminate. After this DOJ DHHS guidance, the Department of Justice has now been investigating other states. For example, it's reached agreements with the state of Oregon and the state of Georgia. And in each case, the Department of Justice has found that parents with disabilities have been treated unfairly. This most recently happened in the state of Arizona, where a decision was released that found concerns regarding equitable treatment of parents with disabilities. And I know Arizona, where I live, actually already had been making changes and had hired an ADA coordinator and all sorts of changes before the report was released. So I'm glad that they're in the right, going in the right direction. So the question is this joint guidance a law? Well, it's actually not a law. It's the first federal guidance we have on whether parents with disabilities are protected by anti-discrimination laws at the federal level, but it's just an interpretation of the law. So this guidance doesn't actually carry the force of law, but it can influence how laws are enforced. And it's often treated sort of as authoritative by courts and agencies. Okay, so this now changed just last year. And that is with the release of new regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So I said before, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act affects organizations that receive federal funding. That includes universities like my university, ASU, actually any university that gets Pell Grants. So that's almost all universities, K through 12 schools, most hospitals and healthcare providers, and also state agencies such as child protection agencies. So the Rehabilitation Act was originally passed in the early 1970s. The first regulations, the release of the regulations sort of helped the disability movement actually gain steam. And if you want to watch a movie about the disability rights movement, I suggest watching Crip Camp. Crip Camp, you can find it free online. And Crip Camp talks about how the disability rights movement sort of coalesced in arguing for the release of the regulations about the Rehabilitation Act in the 1970s. Well, they update these regulations. So there's federal laws, and then there's regulations about how they're to be implemented. And these were updated in 2024. This is just, about 9 years after the joint guidance by the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services. And in the new rules, based on this increased attention to parents with disabilities and discrimination that they faced, they included parents with disabilities in the regulations for the first time in 2024. So it clearly says that parents with disabilities cannot be discriminated against in child protection agencies in the new regulations. It's very specific about child protection agencies. And it says there can be no more decisions based on stereotypes or speculations or assumptions about a person's disability, that child welfare agencies are supposed to use objective evidence and individualized assessment. So you can't make a stereotype, like people with this type of disability need this accommodations. You have to make decisions based on the individual person. For example, a child cannot be removed solely because they have a low IQ or they're blind. So it sort of goes in face of those state statutes that are very vague and don't provide definitions. Well, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says that's not okay anymore. It also says that child protection agencies have to provide equal access to services and programs. This can be things like parenting classes or any reunification efforts or visitation or foster care licensing, that agencies have to provide reasonable supports just as they would to other parents. And also, and importantly, there's requirements for fair parenting evaluation. So when evaluating parenting capacity, agencies have to use research-based tools administered by qualified professionals tailored to the individual parent. So rather than making assumptions or focusing on a parent's disability, they have to focus on what the actual parenting capacity is of an individual parent. So no longer is something like an IQ score enough to judge parenting ability, which had been happening frequently. So no longer determining that a parent has a disability, you have to determine whether they can parent or not. So you have to focus on the parent's actual abilities to safely care for their child. The other federal laws that were listed on there were the Adoption of Safe Families Act and CAPTA, which are child welfare laws, and they sort of shape how the child protection systems are operated. But these anti-discrimination laws really cover how we provide services and supports for parents with disabilities and protect them from having their kids removed without cause. The final federal law that I want to just briefly touch on is Medicaid, and I'll touch on that because it relates to the next concept. And currently, Medicaid waivers provide a lot of the supports for home and community-based living for people with disabilities, but I just want to note that this doesn't assist them with parenting. It focuses just on their individual needs. And this is sort of a segue to the next part of this training, which is focusing on 8 core concepts and frameworks. So when I was developing this training, as I said before, I talked with an expert panel of parents with disabilities and social service providers and national experts and lawyers, and asked them, if you could talk to social workers and social service providers, what are the basic things you would want them to know? And we did a couple of different focus groups and sort of coalesced these down to 8 core concepts. So these are what experts in the field and parents with disabilities want people to know about working with parents with disabilities. And I will go through each of these sort of briefly, but these will give you an overview. The first 4 concept is the concept of parental supports. People with disabilities often receive individual supports to help them participate in life activities such as school, work, participating in community events, recreation, community living. So supports are these general technologies and personal supports that enhance individual functioning. And this is actually a definition from the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And our whole disability support system has sort of evolved around this concept of individual supports. So our disability support system provides supports for individuals to participate in these activities. These supports can include personal assistance, job coaching, transportation, those sorts of things. Parental supports is essentially the same idea of individual supports, but expanded to the concept of parenting. And this is something that we haven't really done in our policies that support where we can fund these kinds of supports. But parental supports refer to formal and informal assistance that help parents with disabilities take care of their children. And while all parents draw on various supports, I did actually when my kids were little, my kids went to childcare, my kids had coaches, my kids had tutoring, etc. Well, so while all parents draw on these types of supports, parents with disabilities might need specific support, such as in-home parenting training or adaptive equipment or parenting assistance. So parental supports are the same thing as individual supports. They're technologies or personal supports that assist them in parenting. The dilemma we have right now, our disability system hasn't evolved enough to provide these types of supports. A parent with a disability might be able to get personal assistance to help themselves get dressed in the morning or help themselves get a ride to work, but might not be able to get assistance to help them get their child dressed or take their child to an appointment. As all parents receive supports for parenting, like all in general, such as grandparents assisting with a newborn to formal childcare to tutoring that I mentioned, parents with disabilities should not be assessed differently for having parental supports to assist them in parenting. And we might need to eventually change the funding structure so we have funding to support these parenting supports. So that's the first concept, is sort of expanding beyond individual supports to think about parental supports. The next three are three concepts that are applied differently to disabled parents. And I want to note, I'm generally saying parents with disabilities, but I recognize that many people with disabilities are now using disability first language. So disabled parents, I usually switch back and forth when I'm talking about parents with disabilities. So these three concepts are: parental risk factors are not causal for child endangerment, the good enough parenting standard, and the presumption of unfitness bias. Okay, so first, talk about risk factors. So in child welfare, child protection, we often consider risk factors for child maltreatment. But all risk factors really are the statistical likelihood that someone with a certain characteristic or experience will maltreat their child. Some common parental risk factors are being a young parent or being a parent who is a parent who has experienced abuse themselves as a child. So risk factors, the statistical likelihood, risk factors are not predictive for individuals. So for example, just because a parent is young does not mean that they will maltreat their child. It just means they're statistically more likely to maltreat their child. So this concept should apply to parents with disabilities. So first of all, parental disability is not actually a risk factor, is often erroneously treated as a risk factor for maltreatment. In fact, there's actually little evidence that parental disability is in itself a risk factor. We talked about it before, it's poverty or unstable housing are the risk factors. But even if parents with certain types of disabilities were more likely to maltreat their children because of associated risk factors, we have to remember that most parents with disabilities do not abuse or neglect their kids. So we have to be very careful not to think that having a risk factor makes it inevitable that a parent with a disability will maltreat their child. So this is one concept, is to remember that risk factors cannot be predictive for individuals. They're not causal for child endangerment. The second is the good enough parenting standard. The good enough parenting standard focuses on whether a parent can meet their child's basic needs and ensure their safety. So it's a standard, that's the standard, rather than requiring flawless parenting. So this concept of the good enough parenting standard was developed by a psychiatrist named Winnicott. And this concept sort of acknowledges that all parents have imperfections. I certainly do. And that these can actually support a child's resilience and growth. And that's what some of the research has found for kids of parents with disabilities. And I think it's important for mandated reporters and child protection workers and other social service providers to be careful to remember that child protection services are not intended to enforce ideal parenting, but to step in when a child is at risk of harm. And so parents with disabilities should be assessed with the same good enough parenting standard as other parents. They deserve a fair chance to demonstrate their capacity to parent with reasonable parental supports. And professionals working with parents with disabilities should not overlook the essential question, is the child safe and are their basic needs met? And by focusing on these sort of deviations from the ideal rather than genuine risk, the child protection system may intervene in families where there's a parent with disability unnecessarily. And then finally, the presumption of unfitness bias. And this might be the most important one, I think, and it is an umbrella for all the other ones. And this is one of the most common and harmful biases faced by parents with disabilities, this presumption of unfitness bias. It's got a long name and is a mouthful, but it's pretty descriptive. This bias assumes that a parent is incapable of safely and effectively raising a child simply because of their disability, without any evidence of harm or neglect. This bias affects parents with all types of disabilities, but it is especially pronounced for those who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, who are often viewed as unfit to parent simply because of their diagnosis or their label or their IQ number. And some of these laws that we were talking about before actually, said if you can determine that they have a low IQ, then that's grounds for termination of parental rights. This misperception can lead to increased scrutiny and unnecessary involvement in child protection services, like we saw in the Sarah Gordon case. In many cases, these referrals are made not because there is evidence of abuse or neglect, but simply because a parent has a disability, sort of this gut feeling people have that a parent with a disability is unfit to parent. And as a result of this bias, as well as those state laws that still exist, these investigations can focus more on the parent's diagnosis than whether the child is actually safe and cared for, reinforcing discriminatory practices and policies. So the impact of this extends well beyond child protection. And actually, many parents with disabilities become fearful of professionals, whether they're social workers or teachers or doctors, because they understand about mandated reporting and they're worrying that any interaction might lead to a child protection report. This fear can lead to social isolation, reluctance to seek help, and avoidance of services that might otherwise support them in their parenting. And been involved in several studies that have shown that parents with disabilities actually have very little social supports and might reduce services when they become a parent. So understanding and really challenging the presumption of unfitness bias is essential for creating fair, equitable, and evidence-based practices and supports for people with disabilities. Another core concept is the concept of universal design. So this is an approach to creating physical spaces, programs, and services that are accessible to as many people as possible. And the most familiar and common example of this is the curb cut. And you can see the picture of the curb cut outside of my building at Arizona State University. So the curb cut benefits all sorts of people, not just people who use wheelchairs, but also parents who use strollers, cyclists, people who are using those dangerous scooters, delivery workers, people rolling backpacks or suitcases, all sorts of people. In everyday life, we see universally designed features all over the place, such as accessible playgrounds and online grocery shopping. And these can help people with a range of needs, but they include parents with disabilities who can benefit from things like accessible playgrounds who are designed primarily for kids with disabilities, or online grocery shopping that became really popular during COVID, could be really helpful for parents with disabilities, as well as many other people. So this inclusive approach can also be applied to any sort of social service or family support services or child welfare services. So like by offering, for example, for schools or child protection agencies or family agencies, offering parenting information in multiple formats, such as visual, audio, easy to read materials, etc., services become available, more accessible and available to all parents, including parents with disabilities. Now, this doesn't mean that providing accommodations, that you don't have to provide accommodations and tailored services if you focus on universal design, but integrating universal design into programs and help reduce barriers, can help reduce barriers and ensure broader and more equitable access to vital resources. So the final three concepts and frameworks are frameworks for understanding disability. And these frameworks can help you sort of situate your understanding of your practice with people with disabilities. I'm going to talk about each of these really briefly. The first is the disability rights framework. The disability rights framework is rooted in the principles of equality, self-determination, and the removal of societal barriers, and is really focused on full participation, like getting rid of these barriers that help people with disabilities get to be included in society. And so this emerged from the broader disability rights movement in the 1960s and the 70s. And this approach emphasized that people with disabilities have the same rights as others do to live independently, that led to the independent living movement, make their own choices and receive the supports they need to thrive. And it really focuses on challenging discriminatory systems and policies, and notably pushing for policy change that ensure equal opportunity and access. So applied to parents with disabilities, the disability rights framework focuses on reforming policies and practices that limit the ability to parent based on bias or lack of support. So it prioritizes policy advocacy and legal protections to uphold the rights of disabled parents and promote inclusive family support. So the advocacy regarding changing state statutes that we're seeing a little bit of that include parental disability as a removal reason, or pushing for making child protection agencies specifically included in the Rehabilitation Act regulations, can be understood within this framework of increasing rights and increasing anti-discrimination policies that cover parents with disabilities. So that's one framework. The next framework is the social model of disability. So the social model of disability is a widely recognized framework that shifts the focus from an individual's impairment to societal barriers. So this social model of disability originated in the United Kingdom in the 1970s at about the same time as the disability rights framework. And it's now embedded in international policies such as the United Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which the United States has not ratified. And many countries use the social model of disability in their national disability law or policy. What the social model emphasizes that the disability is actually not caused by a person's impairment or condition, but rather by physical, systemic, and attitudinal barriers in society. It's often contrasted with a medical model of disability, which focuses on individual deficits. So looking at the disability as a problem. The social model of disability views society as actually causing the disability, not an individual's impairments. This model highlights how challenges in parenting for parents with disabilities often stem from inadequate support systems, inaccessible services, discriminatory state laws, discriminatory assumptions like the presumption for unfitness bias, rather than from the parent's disability itself. So rather than viewing the parent themselves as inherently limited, the social model really places the attention to how society fails to provide the necessary resources and inclusive practices that would enable a parent to parent effectively. So that's the second framework. So you can see they're a little bit different. They're all complementary to each other. The third one is the disability justice framework. And this is really a 21st century approach that expands on the disability rights movement and certainly is influenced by the social model of disability. But the disability justice framework views ableism as deeply connected to other forms of oppression, such as racism or sexism or economic inequality. The disability justice framework emphasizes that disability cannot be understood in isolation by itself, and that people experience ableism and discrimination in different ways depending on their intersecting identities, including race, gender, and class. And they don't talk about this as much, but I would include parenting status. The framework also calls for a more holistic understanding of oppression and the ways it shapes lives of people with disabilities. One way that makes it different from the traditional disability rights framework, which also often focuses on policy reforms and legal reforms, disability justice sort of prioritizes sort of broader transformational change that goes beyond changing policies. But for social service providers, the disability justice framework really gears them towards understanding how multiple layers of discrimination can affect families. For example, a social worker working with an Indigenous mother with an intellectual disability requires awareness not only of the presumption of unfitness bias, which is pervasive, but also the traumas associated with the Indian boarding school system. And both of these sort of traumas that a parent had faced, and including the eugenics movement, can affect how they interact with society, the biases they face, how they parent their kids, etc. So a disability justice approach encourages workers to push for systemic change while also challenging everyday practices and attitudes that marginalize disabled parents, and to recognize the traumas associated with multiple types of oppression that vary based on multiple intersecting identities. Together, these 8 core concepts and frameworks can provide a grounding for social workers and other social service providers when working with parents with disabilities. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about practice interventions and models. There are actually a number of practice interventions and models that have been developed for working with parents with disabilities. And I won't go into this a lot, but there's both evidence-based interventions. These are based on randomized controlled trials, which is essentially where you have 2 groups and they're randomly assigned, so you can see whether an intervention works or not, or promising practices, which are also based on rigorous research, but maybe not at the same level. And there's a number of different places where you can look and find what evidence-based practices and promising practices are. But there are both evidence-based and promising practices for working with parents with disabilities. So the 2 main areas of intervention research related to parents with disabilities focus on parenting skills and social support interventions. So most of our evidence-based or promising practice focuses on parenting skills. There's roughly 4 dozen or more intervention studies that focus on how parents with disabilities can increase or improve their parenting skills. Most of these studies have focused on parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's so many now that there's actually a Cochrane review, so you can look up and look at a systematic review of parenting skills interventions. These include interventions such as weekly home visits with training, weekly visits with tailored lessons, books, video feedback in home. All of these parenting skills interventions for parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities focus on individualized training. They focus on breaking things down into small pieces and repetition and plain language. And there's many others too that didn't use randomized control trials, but there's game-based ones, and there's in-home training and training classes, manuals, modifying parenting training programs that exist for others. So we actually have a whole host of parenting skills interventions that a social service agency could use in working with parents with disabilities. This doesn't mean that they're used a lot because there isn't funding for most of these. But we do have quite a bit of evidence for parenting skills interventions. Now, I'm a social worker, so while I like the idea and I think it's really important to focus on developing parenting skills, I'm more interested in the person in the environment, which is the social work approach. So I'm a little more interested in social support interventions. And there's less evidence for these social support interventions than there are for the skill-based interventions. There are some promising practice that's more focused on developing a social support network or changing social supports for parents with disabilities. And these are five that I will talk about, though there are some others as well. So the social support intervention with the most evidence are structured support groups. And these aren't parent training groups like for the parenting skills training, but these are structured support groups that have parents sort of understand their situation and help navigate the systems and understand the barriers that they're facing. And there's evidence that these structured support groups help increase the size of social networks and increase parents' perceptions of their parenting ability. So this is one type of social support intervention. Another one that I actually developed with a colleague is parent-centered planning, which adapts the person-centered planning model, which is ubiquitous in supports for individuals with disabilities, particularly transition age youth with disabilities, but to focus on parents with disabilities to help them set goals and take steps towards broadening their social support network and getting supports and services to assist them with their parenting. And we found that parents who are involved in parent-centered planning solidify their social support networks and actually take steps towards getting services and supports to help them parent their kid. Another social support intervention is the Peer Navigator program. Peer Navigator programs have been implemented in Vermont and the DC area. And while these haven't been, the evaluations of them haven't been published in peer-reviewed papers, they have been found to be effective and valued by parents with disabilities in helping them navigate the system. So this is when more seasoned parents are matched with newer parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities to help them navigate what it's like to be a parent with a disability in today's society. Another broader intervention is specialized court advocacy, which helps parents with disabilities who are involved in court or administrative hearings to be able to navigate this process and understand what's going on. So we found that parents with disabilities often aren't clear all the details that are going on, for example, when they're in the child protection system. And specialized court advocates are trained advocates who can help translate the concepts to a parent with a disability who's involved in a hearing, as well as help them make their cases clear to the other parties in the process. And these specialized court advocacy programs can assist parents with disabilities to not agree to something such as voluntary termination of parental rights without clearly understanding what they're agreeing to. A final social support intervention is really a policy intervention, and that is changing the state policies to allow the use of Medicaid waivers to pay for parental supports. There are a few states who have small or model programs or who have done research into whether this is possible. But I think this might actually be the way that we end up funding parental supports, is to broaden our Medicaid waivers. This might not be possible in today's political environment, but eventually I think broadening the types of supports that Medicaid waivers can fund to include parental supports might allow more parents with disabilities to get the supports they need to effectively parent their kids and keep kids with their parents and out of foster care. While this probably isn't happening too much right now, there are some states like Minnesota and North Dakota which do have and have proposed model programs to use Medicaid waivers to pay for supports. Okay, finally on to the last section, and that's best practice tips. These are best practice tips that I think social workers and social service providers need to think of when they're working with parents with disabilities, really in any situations. The first is to use a strengths-based approach, and social service practitioners should take a strengths-based approach to working with all people, including parents with disabilities, recognizing that many parents with disabilities are good parents. Most parents with disabilities do not abuse their kids. This is in opposition to the presumption of unfitness bias. Also, focus on building parenting skills. We know that there's lots of interventions that have proved to be effective, that parents with disabilities can, especially intellectual and developmental disabilities, can build their skills. So try to incorporate some of these into their practice. Using appropriate communication is always appropriate when working with parents with disabilities, and that depends, of course, completely on the individual's communication needs, whether they need an interpreter, an ASL interpreter, or whether they need plain language and repetition based on their disability. It's very important for social service providers to understand the trauma that is associated with disability discrimination. The eugenics movement was not that long ago. Many states still have laws that are influenced by the eugenics movement or by the presumption of unfitness bias. And many parents with disabilities can tell you lots of ways that they've had this disability discrimination based on their parenting. So when working with parents with disabilities, understand this and understand why they might be reluctant to share a whole lot with you. It's important for social workers and other social service providers to seek out resources on parenting with a disability. Don't try to figure it all out yourself. Connect with disability organizations. There's national organizations. I'm going to give you some links in a second. Of course, as we're informed by the disability justice framework, it's also important to practice with cultural sensitivity and recognize that parents with disabilities have multiple intersecting identities, and to be aware of all of these when you're working with someone. Obviously, making sure your services are accessible. You can think about universal design when you think of accessible services. So try to make all your services broadly accessible, but also make accommodations and modifications as necessary. Tying back to the strengths approach, one way to take the strengths approach is to view parents as the experts in their kids and the experts in their families. They know themselves and their family the best, and to view them as experts and decision makers, and to view them as wanting to be good parents is probably one of the best things social workers and social service providers can do to practice appropriately and fairly and equitably with parents. But if parents with disabilities do become involved in legal, in a legal situation, help and support them in legal advocacy. It's important to provide tailored services to parents with disabilities. This is now required by the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, especially for child protection agencies, but that really should be for all parents with disabilities. Also think, when you're thinking about disabilities, expand your understanding and recognize that there's folks who might have invisible disabilities that you're interacting with, and to not make judgments about people without understanding their particular situation. Collaborate and consult as much as possible. Facilitate social support networks for parents with disabilities. We know many parents, especially with intellectual and developmental disabilities, have very, very small social networks. So helping them through support groups or connecting them with peer navigators, whether these are formal programs or informally, can be helpful. And finally, be an advocate. If I can leave you with one thing, it's that parents with disabilities have experienced a lot of discrimination, both systematic discrimination, individual discrimination, and biases, and they really need social service providers to advocate for them. I will now just point out some resources for you. There's 3 large organizations. One is the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. This organization probably has the most resources for social workers, social service providers. They have whole sections on this, also legal advocates, also parents with disabilities, and community members. This is a National Research Center. I'm an investigator with the National Research Center. It's housed at Brandeis University, and I'll share the link with you in a second. But this probably has the most information for social service providers in supporting parents with disabilities. The second is a nonprofit organization. It's an international nonprofit organization based in Washington called the Association for Successful Parenting, A Chance to Parent. And TASP has been around for a while, and I think it's been an official nonprofit for more than a decade. And it is a mix of social service providers, researchers, and parents, and this organization focuses on intellectual and developmental disabilities, though it's got a broad, it's got a broad reach as well. And they provide trainings, and they also have a international conference that they hold that draws people in who are interested in supporting parents with disabilities. And finally, the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which is referred to as IACID, has a special interest group on parents with intellectual and developmental disability. And this is the group where most of the researchers who focus on parents with disabilities internationally interact with each other. So these are the 3 main agencies where you can find a lot of information on working with parents with disabilities. I also want to point you to this user-friendly guide for supporting parents with disabilities. I created this based on this training, so there's information on almost everything I said is in this user-friendly guide, plus much more. There's links to these national organizations, many state and local organizations, and a reading list for more information. So I would encourage you to take a shot of this QR code, or you can also see a link to this below the video. So this user-friendly guide provides you all sorts of links for more information and provides an overview of all these concepts as well. So I want to thank you for listening to this training. I also want to thank the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council for sponsoring this training. And I thank you for your interest in supporting parents with disabilities. Thank you.